Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. Mom, we need to discuss your finances before things get complicated. Those were the words my son Jason spoke only 3 hours after we buried my husband. 3 hours. After 47 years of marriage, after standing beside Richard's casket while neighbors, friends, and relatives offered their condolences, after shaking so many hands that my fingers felt numb, I came home believing I would finally have a moment to breathe. Instead, I walked into my dining room and found my children waiting around the table. The same oak table where Richard and I had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and Christmas dinners. The same table where we once sat helping them with homework when they were little. But that evening the room felt different. Colder somehow. The casserole dishes brought by kind neighbors sat untouched on the kitchen counter. The sympathy cards were stacked neatly beside a vase of white lilies. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the backyard. Everything looked normal. Nothing felt normal. Jason sat at the head of the table. Melissa was beside him. Vanessa sat quietly with a yellow legal pad in front of her. For a moment, I thought they were helping organize funeral paperwork. I thought they were trying to make things easier for me. I was wrong. Mom, Melissa said softly, folding her hands together. We're worried about you. I lowered myself into a chair and nodded. At 72, I had learned that people often begin difficult conversations with words that sound kind. That's sweet of you, I said. But I'll be all right. Jason exchanged a glance with Vanessa. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Richard always told me that the truth usually lived in the moments people thought nobody was watching. The house is pretty large, Jason continued, and managing everything alone might be overwhelming. I looked around the room. Every wall held a memory. Every piece of furniture carried part of our story. Richard had built the bookshelves himself 20 years ago. The grandfather clock near the hallway had belonged to his father. This house wasn't simply property. It was our life. I'm not planning to go anywhere, I replied. Silence settled over the table. Melissa cleared her throat. Vanessa flipped a page on her legal pad. Jason leaned forward. We just think it's important to discuss things now, before there's confusion later. Confusion. The word lingered in the air. I noticed paperwork spread across the table. Bank statements, insurance documents, property tax records. My stomach tightened. They weren't talking about my future. They were talking about my money. What exactly are we discussing? I asked. Nobody answered immediately. Melissa stared at her coffee cup. Vanessa looked down at her notes. Jason finally spoke. Dad had assets. You have assets. We need to understand what happens eventually. Eventually. It was a strange word to hear while I was still wearing the black dress from my husband's funeral. I folded my hands in my lap and listened. They began discussing numbers. Retirement accounts. Investment funds. Home equity. Life insurance. Not one of them asked how I was sleeping. Not one of them asked if I had eaten. Not one of them asked how it felt to come home to an empty bedroom for the first time in nearly 5 decades. They spoke about my life as if I were already gone. And as I sat there listening, I realized something far more painful than losing Richard. The people I had spent my entire life protecting were already dividing pieces of a future they assumed belonged to them. That meeting ended only when the sun disappeared behind the trees and the room became too dark to ignore. One by one, my children gathered their papers and left. They offered polite goodbyes. They even hugged me. Yet every embrace felt strangely hollow, as though they were comforting someone they had already begun leaving behind. When the front door finally closed, silence settled over the house. Real silence. The kind that presses against your ears. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the untouched casserole dishes. Friends had filled my refrigerator with enough food for 2 weeks. Sympathy came easily from strangers. It was family that suddenly felt distant. I poured myself a glass of water and looked through the window above the sink. Richard always watered the flower beds before sunset. Every evening. Winter. Summer. Rain or shine. The garden outside looked exactly as he had left it a week earlier. For a moment, I almost expected to see him walking across the yard carrying the green watering can he refused to replace even after the handle cracked. But there was only emptiness. I carried my glass upstairs and paused outside our bedroom. I had avoided that room since returning from the cemetery. The door was half open. The lamp on Richard's side table remained exactly where it had always been. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside the novel he never finished. Everything looked ordinary. That was the cruel part. The world had not changed its appearance, only its meaning. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked around. 47 years of marriage lived inside those walls. Vacations, arguments, celebrations, late-night conversations, plans for retirement. We had spent years discussing what life would look like when the children were fully grown. We imagined road trips across the country, quiet mornings on the porch, weekends with grandchildren visiting. Never once did we imagine that only days after his passing, our children would be discussing account balances and property values. I opened the drawer of Richard's nightstand and found a small notebook. He used to keep reminders inside it. Appointments, grocery lists, little things. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed several notes about home repairs he wanted to complete that spring. A loose hinge, a cracked fence board, new mulch for the flower beds. Ordinary concerns from an ordinary man. Reading those simple notes hurt more than any dramatic speech could have. They reminded me that Richard had been planning to live. He had been planning tomorrow. I closed the notebook and placed it back inside the drawer. Then I remembered something from earlier that afternoon. While Jason spoke about assets and future arrangements, Vanessa had been taking notes. Detailed notes. Not grief notes. Not funeral notes. Financial notes. At the time I had pushed the thought aside. Now it returned with uncomfortable clarity. I walked downstairs and found myself standing in the dining room again. The chairs remained slightly pulled away from the table. A forgotten coffee cup sat beside one of the folders. They had left in such a hurry that nobody bothered to clean up. I stared at that cup for a long moment. Then I noticed a single sheet of paper partially tucked beneath it. My name appeared at the top. Beneath it were handwritten figures and percentages. Next to the value of my home, someone had written a simple sentence. Sell within 6 months. I felt the temperature in the room drop. Not because of the paper itself. Because suddenly I realized they were making plans that did not include asking me what I wanted. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because sleep no longer seemed interested in staying. The house felt unfamiliar in the early hours. Richard had always been the first one awake. He would grind coffee beans, read the newspaper, and leave the sports section folded beside my plate. That morning there was only silence. I made coffee for one and carried the mug to the back porch. The air was cool. A light breeze moved through the trees. Everything outside appeared calm, yet a strange uneasiness followed me everywhere. The paper I had found the night before remained on my mind. Sell within 6 months. 3 simple words. 3 words that had not come from me. I tried convincing myself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps it was only a suggestion. Perhaps I was reading too much into it. But deep down I knew better. People do not write plans on paper unless they have already discussed them. Around noon Melissa called. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She asked how I was doing. She asked whether I had eaten lunch. Then, almost casually, she mentioned that Jason wanted to stop by later that evening. Something about her tone made me pay closer attention. It felt rehearsed, careful, as though she were following a script. I agreed to the visit and spent the afternoon sorting sympathy cards. There were dozens of them. Former coworkers, church friends, neighbors, people who remembered Richard for his kindness. Many included handwritten memories. One neighbor wrote about how Richard had helped repair a fence after a storm. Another recalled how he delivered groceries during a difficult winter. Reading those notes reminded me of something important. My husband had spent his entire life building relationships. Not transactions. Relationships. By evening, Jason arrived with Vanessa. They entered carrying bakery cookies and polite smiles. Vanessa complimented the flowers in the living room. Jason asked whether I needed help with anything around the house. Their friendliness would have seemed comforting to anyone who had not been sitting at that dining room table the day before. We talked about ordinary things for nearly 30 minutes. Weather, family, church. Then the conversation shifted. It happened so smoothly that I almost admired the effort. Jason asked whether I had considered downsizing. Vanessa mentioned how difficult large homes could be for older people. They spoke gently, patiently, as though introducing an idea they expected me to accept. I listened without interrupting. Finally, Jason leaned back in his chair. You know, Mom, it might be easier if we started organizing things sooner rather than later. Organizing things. Another careful phrase. Another attempt to avoid saying what they actually meant. I looked directly at him. For the first time since Richard's funeral, neither of us looked away. Then Vanessa opened a folder she had brought with her. She slid a sheet of paper across the table. At the top was the name of a local real estate agent. In that moment, every remaining doubt disappeared. They had not been discussing possibilities. They had already begun making preparations. The only thing they had forgotten to do was ask whether I intended to leave. I did not touch the paper right away. I simply looked at it resting on the table between us. The logo of the real estate agency sat at the top of the page, clean and professional. Beneath it was a photograph of a smiling agent standing in front of a large suburban home. Vanessa folded her hands and waited. Jason watched my face carefully. They both seemed to expect resistance, maybe even tears. Instead, I took a slow sip of coffee and placed the cup back on its saucer. That is interesting, I said. Jason relaxed slightly. Vanessa offered a small smile. They mistook my calmness for agreement. People often do. Richard used to say that silence made others reveal more than questions ever could. So I stayed silent. Within minutes, they began talking again. They explained how much the house might be worth in the current market. They mentioned lower maintenance, simpler living, fewer responsibilities. Every sentence sounded reasonable on the surface. Yet something beneath their words felt rushed. As though they were not discussing my future but trying to reach a destination before I noticed the road they had chosen. Eventually they left. Another round of hugs. Another round of careful smiles. The moment their car disappeared down the street, I carried the folder into Richard's old study. The room still smelled faintly of leather-bound books and cedar wood. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting narrow lines across his desk. I sat in his chair and opened the folder. Inside were brochures, market reports, and handwritten notes. Some pages had dates written in the corners. I studied them one by one. Then I noticed something strange. Several notes were dated more than 2 weeks before Richard passed away. I checked again. The dates did not change. My pulse quickened. That meant these conversations had started while my husband was still alive. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. For a long time I said nothing. Memories began surfacing. Small moments I had ignored. Jason asking unusual questions about retirement accounts. Vanessa offering to help organize financial documents. Melissa suddenly becoming interested in property taxes and insurance policies. At the time, I had assumed they were simply being responsible adults. Now those conversations looked different. Each memory felt like another puzzle piece sliding into place. The next afternoon, I drove to the grocery store. Halfway through my shopping trip, I heard someone call my name. Turned and saw Grace Morgan pushing a cart filled with vegetables and bottled water. Grace had been my closest friend for nearly 30 years. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. We sat together at a small cafe near the front entrance. I told her everything. The meeting after the funeral. The paperwork. The real estate folder. The dates. Grace listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she stirred her tea and looked out the window. Eleanor, she said quietly, there is something I have been debating whether to tell you. Her expression was unlike anything I had seen before. Serious. Hesitant. Concerned. Then she lowered her voice. A month ago, I saw Vanessa having lunch with a local real estate agent. They were looking at photographs of your house. Suddenly the folder on Richard's desk no longer felt like a plan. Felt like evidence. Grace was not the kind of person who enjoyed gossip. In 30 years of friendship, I had never known her to exaggerate or invent a story. That was what made her words so unsettling. We sat quietly for a moment while shoppers pushed carts past the cafe. The ordinary sounds around us felt strangely distant. Are you certain it was Vanessa? I asked. Grace nodded. I am. I remember because I thought it was unusual. Richard was still alive. I assumed maybe they were helping someone else buy a house. I stared into my coffee. A month earlier. That detail refused to leave my mind. Richard had still been making plans then. He had still been tending the garden. He had still been talking about replacing the deck boards before summer. Meanwhile, someone had apparently been discussing the future of our home without either of us knowing. When I returned home that afternoon, I parked in the driveway and sat in the car longer than necessary. The house looked exactly as it always had. White siding, blue shutters. The porch swing Richard built during our 10th year of marriage. Every inch of that property held a memory. Jason learned to ride a bicycle on that driveway. Melissa planted flowers beside the walkway when she was 8 years old. We celebrated graduations, birthdays, and holidays there. I found it difficult to understand how anyone could look at that history and see only a financial asset. Inside, I walked from room to room slowly. The living room, the kitchen, the study. Each space seemed to carry a different chapter of our lives. By evening, I had made a decision. I would not confront anyone. Not yet. Accusations would only give them an opportunity to explain things away. Instead, I would listen. Observe. Pay attention. The following morning, Melissa called again. This time she sounded slightly nervous. She asked whether I had reviewed the real estate information Jason provided. I told her I was considering it. The answer seemed to satisfy her. After we hung up, I noticed something interesting. Less than 10 minutes later, Jason called with nearly the same question. Their timing felt coordinated, as though they were comparing notes. That evening I opened a drawer in Richard's study where we kept important household records, tax documents, insurance policies, property records, retirement statements. Everything was organized exactly the way Richard preferred. As I sorted through the folders, I noticed several recent requests for account information. Most had reasonable explanations. One did not. A copy of a financial summary had been printed 3 weeks earlier. According to the attached note, someone had requested it during a meeting I never attended. I checked the date twice, then 3 times. The meeting had taken place while Richard was in the hospital. I sat back in my chair and stared at the document. Slowly, the pieces began fitting together. The questions about money, the discussions about selling the house, the meetings, the real estate agent. None of it appeared spontaneous anymore. It looked planned, careful, deliberate. I closed the folder and placed it neatly back into the drawer. Then I looked at a framed photograph sitting on Richard's desk. He was smiling, one arm around my shoulders, standing in front of the house we built together. For the first time since his funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity, and clarity can be far more powerful than anger. Over the next several days, I stopped arguing with reality and started studying it. That turned out to be much more useful. Whenever Jason called to check on me, I sounded grateful. Whenever Melissa suggested that I begin thinking about the future, I thanked her for her concern. Whenever Vanessa offered to help organize paperwork, I smiled and told her I appreciated the support. The more agreeable I became, the more comfortable they seemed. And the more comfortable they became, the more they revealed. One afternoon, Jason stopped by unexpectedly with sandwiches from a local deli. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things. Weather, traffic, his work. Then he casually mentioned that a smaller condominium community nearby had become very popular among retirees. He described the amenities in remarkable detail. The fitness center, the walking path, the maintenance services. It sounded less like a suggestion and more like a sales presentation. I listened patiently while mentally adding another piece to the puzzle. Later that evening, I began organizing my own records. Not because anyone asked me to, because I wanted to know exactly what existed before someone else tried to explain it to me. I reviewed bank statements, investment accounts, property documents, and insurance policies. Richard and I had always been careful planners. Everything was in order. Everything was documented. Yet as I worked through the files, I noticed several inquiries made during the previous few months. Requests for account summaries, questions regarding beneficiary information, copies of records that had been printed and reviewed. Individually, none of it looked alarming. Together, it painted a picture I could no longer ignore. The following week, I scheduled an appointment with Benjamin Cole, the attorney Richard and I had trusted for years. I did not tell my children. I simply called his office and arranged a meeting. Benjamin greeted me warmly when I arrived. His office looked exactly as I remembered. Dark wood furniture, shelves lined with legal volumes, framed photographs of community events hanging on the walls. After a few minutes of conversation, I explained everything. The funeral meeting, the paperwork, the real estate folder, the dates. Benjamin listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me for several seconds. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "there are some things you should probably review." He stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and retrieved a folder with Richard's name on it. My heart tightened. Benjamin placed it on the desk between us. "Your husband updated several documents during the last year," he explained. "Nothing unusual. But he also left instructions that certain materials should only be discussed if specific concerns arose." I stared at the folder. Richard had always been thoughtful, practical, observant. If he anticipated something, there was usually a reason. Benjamin slid the folder closer but did not open it yet. "Before we go any further," he said, "I need to ask you a question. Have your children been showing an unusual interest in your finances?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded slowly. Benjamin looked down at the folder and released a quiet sigh. "I was afraid you might say that." Benjamin opened the folder carefully and removed several documents. Some were familiar. Others were not. I recognized signatures, dates, and legal forms that Richard and I had discussed over the years. Then Benjamin pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. For a moment, the room disappeared. All I could see was that familiar script. The same handwriting that once filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and notes left on the refrigerator door. My throat tightened as Benjamin handed me the envelope. "Richard instructed me to keep this on file," he said. "He wanted you to receive it only if certain circumstances developed." I looked down at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a letter. The paper felt crisp. The words were unmistakably his. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I was probably right about something I hoped I was wrong about." I stopped reading for a moment. Richard always had a way of getting straight to the point. I continued. The letter explained that during the previous year, he had become increasingly concerned about conversations surrounding money and inheritance. He did not accuse anyone directly. That was not his style. Instead, he described observations. Questions that seemed unusually focused on finances, discussions about property values, repeated interest in account information that had never mattered before. As I read each paragraph, memories surfaced. Small moments I had dismissed, comments I had overlooked. Richard had noticed them too. Near the end of the letter, his tone changed. It became more personal. He wrote that he trusted me to make wise decisions. He reminded me that our savings represented decades of work, sacrifice, and careful planning. Most importantly, he wrote that no one should pressure me into choices that did not reflect my own wishes. By the time I reached the final page, my eyes were wet. Not because of the money, because even after he was gone, Richard was still trying to protect me. Benjamin waited quietly while I folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he slid another document across the desk. "There is something else you need to know," he said. The document outlined changes Richard had made several months earlier. Certain assets had been placed under additional protections. Specific provisions would only activate under particular circumstances. The language was legal and detailed, but the purpose was clear. Richard had anticipated the possibility of pressure being placed on me after his death. He had prepared accordingly. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the papers. For the first time, the confusion that had clouded my thoughts began to lift. This was no longer about suspicion. It was no longer about guessing motives. Richard had seen enough to take action before he passed away. Benjamin folded his hands. "There is one more thing," he said quietly. "About 2 months ago, someone contacted my office asking questions about future asset distributions." I looked at him immediately. "Who?" Benjamin hesitated. Then he answered. "The inquiry came from Vanessa. Suddenly, every conversation, every document, and every carefully timed suggestion seemed connected by the same invisible thread. And for the first time I realized just how far this situation might already have gone. When I left Benjamin's office, I did not feel angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger burns quickly. What I felt instead was something far more useful: patience. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I understood the shape of the situation. The uncertainty was gone. The questions were gone. What remained were choices, and I intended to make mine carefully. During the following week, I allowed everything to continue exactly as it had before. When Jason called, I answered warmly. When Melissa suggested looking at retirement communities, I listened politely. When Vanessa offered to help me review household expenses, I thanked her for being thoughtful. The more cooperative I appeared, the more confident they became. Confidence has a way of making people careless. A few days later, Jason invited me to dinner at his house. He described it as a family gathering. Nothing formal, just an opportunity for everyone to spend time together. I accepted immediately. The evening arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. When I walked into their dining room, the atmosphere felt unusually organized. Papers sat neatly stacked on a side table. Melissa was already there. Vanessa moved through the kitchen carrying serving dishes while exchanging quick glances with Jason. Everything appeared casual. Nothing felt casual. We ate dinner and discussed ordinary topics: work, neighbors, television shows, weekend plans. Then, just as dessert was served, Jason cleared his throat. The room became noticeably quieter. "Mom," he began, "we have all been thinking about what is best for you moving forward." There it was again. The same carefully rehearsed language. The same concern wrapped around an agenda. I smiled and nodded for him to continue. Melissa leaned forward. Vanessa opened a folder. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. They explained how much easier life could be in a smaller home. They described financial advantages, maintenance advantages, convenience advantages. Every argument sounded polished, refined, repeated many times before reaching my ears. Throughout the conversation, I noticed something interesting. Not one person asked what I wanted. They spoke about my future as though it were a project already underway. At one point, Vanessa slid several pages toward me. Property estimates, housing options, sample moving timelines. She had prepared far more material than anyone would need for a casual discussion. I studied the documents quietly. Then I looked up and saw something I had not noticed before. Excitement. Not concern. Not compassion. Excitement. They were already imagining outcomes. They were already spending emotional currency they had not earned. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back on the table. "You have all clearly invested a great deal of thought into this," I said. Relief immediately appeared on their faces. Jason smiled. Melissa relaxed. Vanessa practically glowed with satisfaction. They believed they were winning. They believed I was finally accepting their plan. None of them knew that Benjamin and I had already scheduled another meeting. None of them knew about Richard's letter. None of them knew about the protections quietly waiting inside those legal documents. So I smiled and thanked them for caring. And as I watched them celebrate a victory they had not actually achieved, I realized something important. Sometimes the strongest position at a table belongs to the person holding the truth while everyone else is busy revealing themselves. 3 days later, I invited everyone to my house for Sunday dinner. The invitation surprised them. For weeks they had been guiding conversations, proposing solutions, and presenting plans. Now I was the one setting the table. By 6 o'clock, everyone had arrived. Jason carried a bottle of sparkling cider. Melissa brought dessert. Vanessa arrived with her usual confident smile. They all seemed relaxed, optimistic, as though the future had already been arranged. We shared a pleasant meal. The conversation stayed light. Family memories, vacation stories, funny moments from years ago. Several times I caught them exchanging glances, waiting for the discussion they expected. Eventually, after the dishes had been cleared, I folded my hands and looked around the table. "There is something I would like to discuss," I said. The room immediately became attentive. Jason leaned forward. Melissa straightened in her chair. Vanessa looked almost eager. Over the past few weeks, all of you have expressed concern about my future, I continued. You have talked about finances, housing, and long-term planning. They nodded. Nobody interrupted. I appreciate that. Relief appeared on their faces. They thought they knew where the conversation was heading. Then there was a knock at the front door. The sound seemed to confuse everyone except me. A few moments later, Benjamin Cole stepped into the dining room carrying a leather briefcase. The expressions around the table changed instantly. Surprise replaced confidence. Benjamin greeted everyone politely and took a seat beside me. No one spoke. For the first time since Richard's funeral, they were no longer controlling the conversation. Benjamin opened his briefcase and removed several documents. He explained that Richard had updated important estate plans before his passing. He explained that additional protections had been placed on specific assets. He explained that these arrangements were designed to ensure that decisions remained entirely mine for as long as I wished. The room grew very quiet. Then he shared portions of Richard's written instructions. Not accusations. Not punishments. Just Richard's own words about independence, respect, and personal choice. As those words filled the room, I watched the faces around the table. Nobody argued. Nobody smiled. Nobody seemed prepared for the possibility that Richard had anticipated exactly this situation. Finally, Benjamin closed the folder. The documents remained in place. The facts remained unchanged. The future they had been planning was not theirs to direct. After a long silence, I stood and looked at my children. I did not raise my voice. I did not criticize them. I simply spoke the truth. Your father spent his life teaching gratitude, I said. I spent my life believing you learned it. No one answered. There was nothing left to say. The conversation ended shortly afterward. One by one, they gathered their things and left. The house became quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. It no longer carried confusion. It carried peace. Later that evening, I walked onto the back porch and watched the sun disappear beyond the trees. The garden Richard loved so much glowed in the fading light. For the first time in many weeks, I felt close to him. Not because of the money. Not because of the legal documents. Because he had trusted me to stand on my own when the moment arrived. And as I sat there in the cooling evening air, I realized something simple and powerful. They had spent weeks preparing for my future. What they never expected was that I was still fully capable of deciding it myself. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.